So thanks to the speaker again.
Thank you very much.
So our next presentation will be given by Phat on systematic review and analysis of multilingual data strategies in text-to-speech for low-resource languages.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Phat. I'm a PhD student at the University of Groningen, in the Netherlands. It's my pleasure to present to you my work here today that I worked on with my supervisors, Matt Kohler and Jelske Dijkstra from Friesland and Pritzker Academy, and Esther Klabbers from ReadSpeaker. For the motivation, low-resource languages in general are languages that lack data for language tunes, and in the domain of text-to-speech, this usually translates to a lack of high-quality annotated recordings of human speakers, which are used to train the acoustic models for the TTS systems. This has been an issue since the era of traditional SPSS, but it is much worsened in the current research climate, which is we can say dominated by the data-hungry neural networks, and especially it is even exacerbated further after the recent introduction and rise in popularity of sequence-to-sequence-based models. And one of the approaches to solve this is to use CTS that is trained on multilingual data. For a quick definition, this is the approach that, in addition to the amount of training data in the target language, which is the name that we use to call the language that we want to synthesize in, we also use training data from other languages, which are usually called source or auxiliary languages in this approach, in order to make up for the lack of training data. This has been done in research since the early 2000s, but to the best of our knowledge, there is yet to be a systematic review on past studies that deal with this topic, and especially with regards to its effectiveness in helping TTS for low-resource languages. And that is why our contribution is firstly to provide a systematic review of the relevant past studies in this topic, and secondly, more importantly, we would like to provide a meta-analysis on this topic. We'd like to find out the correlations between the data strategies. So in other words, how these past studies incorporated the multilingual data into the TTS systems and its effect on the output quality of the TTS voice. By finding such correlations, we hope that it could be useful for future research in this topic. Now we'll move on to the process of study selection. For this review, we use two sources, the Scopus database and the online archive of the ISCAR. There were three criteria to select relevant studies for this. Firstly, these studies need to clearly delineate the design of the TTS systems, the evaluation process and metrics, and the training data that were used, and so on. Secondly, they need to use multilingual data to train. And lastly, they need to involve low-resource languages, or in some cases, there's some simulated lack of training data. We found a total of 23 studies, and from these we extracted, first of all of the possible experiment details that we could obtain from their papers. For example, the architecture that they use, the characteristics of the data that they use for training, and so on. And also we extracted the output quality of the synthesized voice that they reported in their papers. So from those we formed an aggregated data set, which each data observation being the reported output quality accompanied by all of the corresponding experiment details. And in total, this aggregated data set had 880 data observations. So then we move on to the meta-analysis. The first question was, given the same amount of target data, again, that is the amount of training data in the target language that we want to synthesize in, given the same amount of target data, how would the output speech of a multilingual system compare to that of a monolingual system? So in other words, we compared the reported results that from the pairs or groups of experiments that came firstly from the same study, secondly that said all the research design, especially the target data, and would differ from each other only in whether they were trained on multilingual data or monolingual data only. But then there was a little problem. As you can see here on the right, it's a little bit small, but the main idea is that from these 23 included studies, they used a wide range of evaluation metrics for the experiments. There were a total of 18 different evaluation metrics used. And because of that, the problem was how were we supposed to measure and compare this output quality across all of these studies. Because of a lack of suitable metric for this, we created a metric for this purpose. We call it the Multilingual Model Effect, or MLME for short, which is calculated simply by taking the percentage difference of the output quality between the multilingual experiment and that of the monolingual experiment. And this would then be multiplied by -1 if that particular metric can be said to be negatively correlated with the output speech, or in other words, the lower the better. For example, with the malceptual distortion or word error rate, and it would be left as is if it was the other case around, so the higher the better, for example, with MOS or MUSRA. Here in this summary table, we can see the reported median value of the MLME, and on the right column are the p-values of the corresponding Wilkerson test on the hypothesis that these median values are larger than 0. To make it for a short interpretation of this, we can see that although the variation between the median values of the 4 different groups of evaluation metrics seem to be large, our statistical test didn't indicate that they were significantly different from each other. So we can say that, in general, multilingual experiments had improved output quality compared to their monolingual counterparts, but this improvement did not depend on the specific metric group. But probably more interestingly to see is that the median values of all included MLME were quite small, only 3.6% in total. We can see that this is quite a small improvement, so that may pose a problem of whether this multilingual approach is actually worthwhile doing. So we needed to carry on the second question, and that is to find out what factors in the data strategy that affect the MLME. And we propose 5 possible factors for this. The first one is the acoustic model architecture that the included studies use themselves. We can see here in this table that there were in total 4 different acoustic model architecture, but it should be noted that due to lack of information and also lack of data samples, the studies that use unit selection synthesis and HMM-based synthesis could not be included in this data set for question 2. So in the end, there were 164 data observations for DNN-based systems and 76 observations for SOS sequence-to-sequence based systems. The second proposed factor was the amount of target language data. This seemed simple, but it should be noted that most of the included studies only reported the amount of training data either in the time duration or the number of utterances, and not both. And because of this, we needed to try to convert it to the same measurement in order to have calculations with it. So we tried to look at 11 of the included studies which had sufficient data about their data set, sufficient information about their trained data set. So we tried to calculate the average utterance length from those data sets, and it was 6.1 seconds. And we used this to convert all of the amounts of training data in the whole data set to the number of utterances for a uniform calculation. The third proposed factor was the ratio of target data between the corresponding multilingual models and monolingual models. This may sound a bit confusing. So for an example, if the multilingual experiment was trained on 6,000 utterances of the target language and the monolingual experiment was trained on 10,000 utterances, then this ratio would be minus 40%. The next proposed factor was the balance of target data and total data. So for example, if we use 1,500 utterances in the target language of Bengali and there were 8,500 utterances in other source languages, then this ratio would be 15%. The last one is the ratio of source data from the same language family to the total source data. Again, I think it's a bit confusing. So for example, if the target language is the Telugu language and there are 10,000 utterances in the total source languages data, in which there are 4,000 utterances that come from the languages of Kannada, Malayalam, and Tamil, which are in the same language family of Dravidian as Telugu, then this ratio would be 40%. Then from these factors, we try to find a predictive model for the MLME. We use linear mixed effect models for this, and we added the factors one by one, as well as their appropriate interactions where possible, and we kept the significant predictors. For the result, the architecture significantly affected the MLME with a mean difference between DNN and SOS systems of 33.9 percentage points, which is quite large. So we reported and interpreted the results for these two groups of systems separately, as you can see here. Due to the time limit, I invite you to refer to the form paper for a more detailed interpretation of this. But the general idea is that from a base mean value MLME here, minus 0.35% for the DNN models, every increase of, let's say, 100 utterances in the amount of target language data would decrease the MLME by 0.6 percentage point. For a more general and maybe more interesting interpretation for DNN models, the most important factor was the amount of target data. The more target data that is available in the target language, the less potential increase that is in using multilingual systems. This is in line with expectations, so this would be more interesting. The MLME correlates with the balance ratio. So if we are using DNN models for multilingual TTS for low resource languages, this balance ratio should be kept as high as possible to retain the data efficiency. For SOS models, the most important factor was the ratio between the target data between multilingual and monolingual experiments, and this should also be kept as high as possible. What this means is that for low resource languages, we may be tempted to try and keep the total amount of data low, probably because of, let's say, concerns about memory consumption. So we would still need to keep this as high as possible and, let's say, not replace some target data by some source data. The MLME also negatively correlates with the balance ratio. So in other words, having more data is always beneficial, and it is even more important than keeping a balance. And interestingly, for both, the same language family ratio was not significant in its effect on the MLME. And because of this, for future work, we will experiment with other criteria for selecting source languages in this approach. Something related, let's say, about how much these languages share in their phoneme space or inventories or phonetic space, for example. And we also validate the findings that we found in this study empirically with practical experiments. The general idea is that we would like to try to find out the best practices, so-called, in TTS for low resource languages using multilingual data. And that is it for my presentation. Thank you for listening, and I'm looking forward to questions.
So, do we have any questions here from the audience?
No question.
No question. Yes, then I have a question. So when you extracted the parameters from these studies, so what would be like an advice, which parameters should be reported in future studies, that you can also do such investigations, maybe not only in the multilingual scenario, but in others? Like you mentioned, for example, utterance versus duration. That you had some studies that had utterances, number of utterances, others that had the duration.
I think it would be also a good practice for research in this topic or in specialists in general to report. Usually, they either report only the time duration of the data set or the number of utterances without making explicit the let's say the average duration of each utterance, and I think that would make it a bit hard to compare across studies, especially if they involve some proprietary data sets. So I would suggest that it is a good practice to also include that. And for some other variables that should also be included, I think at least for the researches that involve multilingual the TTS, I would think the factors that I found to be significant in this research should probably be considered, well, provided that this research is properly proven empirically in the next study, for example. Well, thank you for your question.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we have a question here.
No, we have a question here in the audience.
Yes, just one question.
No? Thank you. So a very nice talk, I think. So we have meta-analysis papers put forward. Nice. When you are considering language families, I think most of the time it's concerning lexical inventory. It's not very specific to phonology. So are you planning, for example, to consider phonological inventory? So the wealthiness of number of phonemes, vowels and consonants in the target language compared to the source language. So which is something more specific to synthesis, to the requirement of
Yes,
speech generation.
Thank you for the question. That's a very interesting one, and I have to say that I haven't really decided on a specific way to measure it, but what you've mentioned is definitely one of the approaches to be considered. I've been thinking of, like you said, how much, let's say, we should try to calculate, to come up with some kind of measurement that can capture, let's say, the differences in the phoneme inventories of the target language and the source languages. Let's say the number of phonemes. We can also make it more specific by the number of vowels and consonants, and also something related to, let's say, we can try to extract from a corpus of each language the frequency of occurrences of those phonemes, for example. If those two languages have the same high occurrences of the same phonemes, then it may be a good criterion for selecting that language. I have to admit that I haven't really made it more detailed and concrete, but that's what I'm working on next. Thank you for your question.
Okay.
So we have two questions.
Yeah, we have also questions online.
So we have two questions from the online chat. So the first one is, are these monolingual and multilingual models multi-speaker models? If so, how many speakers?
To be honest, I would need to check it again to have a exact answer for this. But I would say some of them was multi-speaker and some of them was not. So sorry for this, but to give a better answer, I think I would need to check the data set again. So maybe I will try to explain this later. Thank you for the question.
And is this information in your paper, or?
It is not yet included in the paper. Sorry.
Okay, and the second question is, thanks for the talk. Were you able to also look at the number and type of speakers per language, and what is the audio quality of both the target and support data?
Thank you for the question. I think the first one was a bit related to the previous question. I believe I do have that information in my aggregated data set about the number of speakers, but due to the length limit of the paper submitted, I couldn't include it in. So I can try to give an answer to that later. And as for the second question,
what is the audio quality of both the target and support data? Audio quality.
I'm not entirely sure what is meant by audio quality here. But as far as I know, it was not explicitly mentioned in the included study, so I would say it's a bit hard to answer this. But I can try to have a look into that.
Okay. And we have just another questions. One question. And also, did you encounter any stability issues with sequence-to-sequence multilingual-based models in low resource settings? Stability issues of sequence-to-sequence multilingual models.
Thank you for the question. I didn't particularly listened or synthesized the output from these studies. What I did in this paper was to use the output quality that they reported in their corresponding papers and use it for the for my statistical analysis. So I'm afraid this would be a bit hard to answer.
Okay.
So
thank you.
Then
no more
thanks
questions.
to the speaker again.
Thank you.